The text message hit my phone at 3 in the morning. London time jarring me awake in my temporary flat near Canary Wharf. Give me the code or I'll break the lock. I know you're ignoring me. My sister Madison's words glowed on the screen with typical entitlement. Within minutes, my parents were calling their voices sharp with accusation through the international connection. You sick boy, you lured her into a trap. My mother's hysteria echoed across the Atlantic as I calmly opened my security app watching the live feed from my former downtown Chicago penthouse. Madison stood confidently at the door she'd somehow breached, directing a locksmith with imperial gestures. She had no idea I'd moved out 2 weeks earlier. The new tenant was about to arrive home early from her night shift, and Madison definitely didn't expect the new resident to be Deputy U.S. Marshal Sarah Chen. The 3 months leading to this moment had been building like storm clouds over Lake Michigan. I'm Darian Walsh, 29 years old, working as a cybersecurity consultant for Fortune 500 companies. My annual income cleared $200,000, which should have meant financial freedom and independence. Instead, it had become a leash that my family used to drag me into their constant drama. My sister Madison had been living rent-free in our parents' basement in Bloomington, Indiana for the past 2 years, supposedly pursuing her artistic vision as a photographer. Her portfolio consisted mainly of over-filtered selfies and pretentious shots of abandoned buildings that she claimed represented urban decay and human resilience. Meanwhile, I'd been quietly funding her lifestyle through a series of emergency loans that never got repaid and temporary help that stretched into permanent support. The cycle was always the same. Madison would call crying about some crisis, usually involving her inability to afford basic necessities because she'd blown her part-time retail job income on expensive camera equipment or weekend trips to music festivals. Our parents, Janet and Robert Walsh, would immediately contact me with guilt-laden speeches about family responsibility and how successful people should lift up those still struggling to find their path. I'd been renting the luxury penthouse at Harbor Point Towers for 18 months, a gleaming 42nd floor unit with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Navy Pier and Lake Michigan. The monthly rent consumed nearly half my income, but the location was perfect for my consulting work. The building's conference rooms and high-speed internet infrastructure allowed me to host client meetings and manage complex cybersecurity implementations without maintaining expensive downtown office space. Madison discovered my address through her typical snooping methods during a family dinner last Christmas. She'd gone through my mail while I was helping Dad fix their furnace, memorizing the return addresses and building logos. Within days, she was posting social media content suggesting she practically lived in a downtown Chicago penthouse, sharing carefully cropped photos from my apartment that made it appear she was the primary resident. Her obsession with my living situation grew progressively worse throughout the winter. She'd invite friends over to our parents' house and casually mention her brother's place in the city, as if she had unlimited access. When pressed for details, she'd claim I'd given her keys and encouraged her to use the apartment whenever I traveled for business, which happened frequently with my consulting contracts. Our parents not only failed to correct these delusions, but actively encouraged them. They suggested I should share the apartment since I was gone, so often arguing that Madison needed inspiration for her photography and that downtown Chicago would provide better artistic opportunities than small-town Indiana. They painted my reluctance as selfishness, constantly reminding me how they'd sacrificed for my college education and how families should support each other during difficult times. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago when I received an unexpected opportunity that changed everything. TechSecure International, a London-based cybersecurity firm, offered me a 6-month consulting contract for their expansion into American markets. The salary was triple my usual rate, plus housing allowance and full relocation assistance. More importantly, It provided the perfect escape route from my family's increasingly toxic demands. I'd been planning my exit strategy for months, knowing that any advance warning would trigger massive family interference. Madison would demand to house sit the apartment our parents would guilt me into maintaining the lease for her benefit, and I'd return from London to find her permanently installed with a new set of unrealistic demands for continued support. Instead, I quietly arranged everything in secret. I terminated my lease early, forfeiting the $3,000 security deposit to ensure a clean break. My furniture went into climate-controlled storage, my mail forwarded to a private mailbox service, and my personal belongings shipped directly to London. The building management company, impressed by my perfect payment history and early termination notice, agreed to waive the standard 60-day notice requirement. The apartment's new tenant was Deputy U.S. Marshal Sarah Chen, a federal law enforcement officer who specifically chose Harbor Point Towers for its security features and proximity to the federal courthouse. She worked fugitive recovery operations, tracking down dangerous criminals who'd skipped bail or violated federal parole. Her schedule was unpredictable, often involving night raids and early morning court appearances, which made the building's 24-hour security and controlled access particularly appealing. Sarah had moved in exactly 2 weeks before Madison's break-in attempt, though my family remained completely unaware of the transition. I deliberately avoided mentioning my departure, knowing the information would immediately trigger demands for apartment access. My plan was to reveal the move after settling into my London routine, presenting it as a completed fact rather than a negotiable decision. Now, watching my security app from 5,000 miles away, I could see Madison's confident swagger as she directed the locksmith she'd hired. She'd brought multiple suitcases and moving boxes, clearly planning a permanent takeover rather than a temporary visit. Her body language radiated entitlement as she gestured toward the apartment door like a queen claiming her rightful throne. The locksmith, a weathered man in his 50s, seemed uncomfortable with the situation but continued working after Madison showed him what appeared to be official documentation. I realized she'd probably forged some kind of residency proof, using old utility bills or lease documents with my name, a federal crime she was committing with typical thoughtlessness about consequences. Through the security camera's audio feed, I could hear Madison on her phone with friends breathlessly describing her new place and how Darian had finally come to his senses about sharing family resources. She was already planning a housewarming party for the weekend, inviting people to see her downtown lifestyle and impressive new address. What Madison didn't know was that Deputy Marshal Chen was returning early from a fugitive apprehension operation in Milwaukee. Sarah's target had been captured ahead of schedule, allowing her team to wrap up the mission 6 hours early. She was exhausted, armed, and looking forward to a quiet morning in her secure apartment before catching up on sleep and paperwork. The convergence was about to create a situation that none of us could have predicted, with consequences that would ripple through multiple lives and several legal systems. My sister's sense of entitlement was about to collide head-on with federal law enforcement, and I had a front-row seat to watch the entire disaster unfold in real time. The live security feed became my window into a catastrophe I was powerless to prevent. Madison had successfully convinced the locksmith to bypass the apartment's electronic entry system, claiming a family emergency that required immediate access to retrieve important documents. Her performance was masterful, complete with crocodile tears and urgent hand gestures that suggested a medical crisis requiring swift action. She'd arrived prepared for permanent occupation. Designer furniture purchased with credit cards linked to my old address was being wheeled through the lobby by moving crew members she'd hired for the day. Expensive artwork, probably charged to accounts she'd opened using my previous billing information, was carefully wrapped and labeled for specific rooms. She'd even brought plants and decorative accessories, transforming what should have been a simple apartment break-in into a full-scale home invasion. Her confidence was absolutely breathtaking. Through the camera's audio pickup, I could hear her directing the movers with imperial authority, assigning them specific tasks like arranging furniture and hanging pictures. She was treating the entire operation like a legitimate relocation complete with detailed floor plans and color-coordinated decoration schemes. The most infuriating part was her social media documentation. Madison was live streaming the entire process on Instagram, narrating her moving day for hundreds of followers who believed they were witnessing her triumphant upgrade to luxury living. She posed with champagne bottles, took selfies against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and gave virtual tours of what she claimed was her new creative space in downtown Chicago. My phone was simultaneously exploding with increasingly frantic calls from our parents. They'd driven 4 hours from Bloomington after Madison contacted them with news of her successful negotiation with me about apartment sharing. They believed they were coming to help their daughter settle into her rightful new home, completely convinced that I'd finally agreed to their long-standing demands for family resource sharing. My mother's voice was particularly shrill when she finally reached me on my London number. "Darian, we're so proud of you. For finally doing the right thing. Madison has been working so hard on her photography, and she deserves this opportunity to pursue her dreams in the city. Your father and I always knew you'd come around to supporting family when it really mattered." The irony was suffocating. They'd constructed an entire narrative around Madison's apartment takeover, casting it as generous, brotherly support rather than criminal breaking and entering. They'd even brought gifts, apparently including expensive household items they'd purchased, to celebrate what they viewed as Madison's successful transition to independent city living. My father's subsequent call was filled with practical questions about building amenities, parking arrangements, and neighborhood safety. He was genuinely concerned about Madison's well-being in the big city, asking about grocery stores, public transportation, and reliable internet service for her photography business. The disconnect between their perception and reality was almost surreal. Meanwhile, Deputy Marshal Sarah Chen was finishing her paperwork at the federal courthouse, unaware that her secure apartment had been invaded by an entitled 26-year-old who believed federal law didn't apply to family emergencies. Sarah's night had been successful but exhausting. Her team had apprehended 3 fugitives in coordinated raids across Milwaukee, including a particularly dangerous individual who'd been evading federal custody for 8 months. Sarah's choice of Harbor Point Towers wasn't accidental. Federal agents, particularly those involved in fugitive recovery, face unique security challenges. Their home addresses must remain confidential to protect against retaliation from criminals they've arrested or their associates seeking revenge. The building's controlled access, professional security staff, and comprehensive surveillance system provided the protection necessary for someone in her position. She'd specifically requested an apartment on the upper floors, away from easy access routes that could be exploited by people wanting to harm federal law enforcement officers. Her unit included reinforced doors, upgraded locks, and direct communication links to building security. The monthly rent was substantial, but federal housing allowances helped offset the cost of maintaining secure living arrangements. Through the security feed, I watched Madison discover what she believed were my personal belongings, but were actually Sarah's possessions. Madison was examining federal credentials, service weapon storage, and official documentation, with growing excitement rather than concern. She'd found Sarah's badge case and gun safe, assuming they belonged to me. Her interpretation was characteristically self-centered. Madison called our parents immediately, her voice bubbling with excitement about discovering that her brother had become some kind of federal agent. She was spinning elaborate theories about my secret law enforcement career using Sarah's professional equipment as evidence that the apartment was definitely family property that she now had every right to occupy. The situation was spiraling beyond simple trespassing. Madison was handling federal credentials, photographing official documents, and broadcasting sensitive law enforcement information to her social media followers. She was unknowingly committing multiple federal crimes while celebrating what she believed was her successful conquest of family resources. Her live stream was documenting everything in real time, creating permanent, digital evidence of premeditated criminal activity. Hundreds of viewers were watching Madison rifle through Sarah's personal belongings, comment on federal equipment, and make detailed plans for redecorating what she assumed was now her permanent residence. Building security was growing concerned about the unusual activity. The overnight security supervisor had noticed the locksmith moving crew and extensive deliveries, but had been assured by Madison that everything was pre-approved by the resident. She'd shown forged documentation and displayed such confidence that the security team initially accepted her explanations. However, their confusion was mounting as they realized the current leaseholder wasn't Darian Walsh, but Sarah Chen, a federal law enforcement officer who'd specifically requested enhanced security measures. The paperwork discrepancies were becoming impossible to ignore, but Madison was so convincing and authoritative that they were hesitant to challenge her directly without additional verification. Sarah's early return was about to transform Madison's confident apartment takeover into a federal incident, with consequences none of us could have anticipated. My sister's sense of entitlement was approximately 15 minutes away from colliding with armed federal authority, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to prevent the disaster from London, except watch helplessly as my family's dysfunction reached spectacular new levels of criminal stupidity. Deputy Sarah Chen's key turned in the lock at exactly 6:47 in the morning Chicago time. I watched through the security feed as she entered her apartment expecting the quiet sanctuary she'd carefully chosen, only to find a strange woman rearranging her furniture while directing a crew of moving personnel like some kind of deranged interior decorator. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She assessed the situation with the calm professionalism that comes from years of dealing with dangerous, unpredictable people. Her right hand moved instinctively toward her service weapon, while her left hand reached for her radio to contact building security. Madison, however, was completely oblivious to the gravity of what was happening. "Oh, perfect timing," Madison announced cheerfully, not bothering to look up from the expensive lamp she was positioning near the living room's panoramic windows. "You must be the cleaning service Darian arranged. I'm Madison Walsh, and I'll be living here now. Could you help us move this couch? I want it facing the lake view for better natural lighting in my photography setup." Sarah's response was measured and clear. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Sarah Chen, and this is my apartment. You need to explain immediately why you're here and how you gained entry." She displayed her federal credentials while maintaining a safe distance from Madison and the moving crew, her professional demeanor masking what must have been complete bewilderment at the surreal situation. Madison's reaction was exactly what I'd expected from years of watching her refuse to accept reality when it conflicted with her desires. She laughed dismissively, waving her hand as if Sarah was a particularly persistent solicitor. "That's ridiculous. This is my brother's apartment and he's finally letting me use it while he's traveling. Nice try with the fake badge, but federal agents don't live in luxury penthouses. Obviously, you're some kind of scam artist trying to steal our family property." The moving crew, sensing trouble, began backing toward the door with obvious nervousness. They'd been hired legitimately through Madison's elaborate deception, but they weren't interested in getting involved in what was clearly becoming a legal dispute. The locksmith was already packing his tools, muttering about family drama and hoping to escape before police arrived. Sarah tried a different approach, speaking directly to the moving personnel. "I'm going to show you my federal identification again, and I need you to understand that this woman has no legal right to be in this apartment. You're being used in the commission of multiple federal crimes, and I strongly suggest you leave immediately before this situation escalates further." But Madison wasn't finished with her performance. She pulled out her phone and began recording Sarah apparently planning to document what she believed was harassment by a fake federal agent trying to steal her family's property. "Everyone can see what's happening here," she announced to her phone camera. "This woman is obviously a con artist who somehow found out my brother was traveling and thought she could take over his apartment. classic scam targeting military families. The federal agent revelation had triggered Madison's most creative delusion yet. She'd convinced herself that my consulting work was actually some kind of classified military operation, and that Sarah's federal credentials were elaborate forgeries designed to exploit my supposed absence on secret government business. Her narcissistic worldview simply couldn't accommodate the possibility that she was wrong about anything. Sarah made the decision to contact her supervisor while maintaining visual contact with Madison. Federal agents' homes are protected by specific laws that carry severe penalties, and Madison's break-in was quickly evolving into a major federal incident. She spoke quietly into her radio, requesting immediate backup and supervisor notification for a residential intrusion involving federal officer safety. Meanwhile, my parents were arriving in the building lobby, their arms full of housewarming gifts, and their faces beaming with pride about Madison's successful negotiation with me for apartment sharing privileges. They'd brought flowers, expensive wine, and a welcome mat embroidered with Madison's Chicago adventure in flowery script. They were genuinely excited to see their daughter's new living situation and completely unprepared for the federal law enforcement crisis unfolding 42 floors above them. Building security was now fully alert to the problem. The overnight supervisor had contacted the day shift manager, who immediately pulled up the lease records and confirmed that Sarah Chen was the legitimate resident. They were reviewing security footage of Madison's forced entry, documenting the locksmith's involvement, and preparing incident reports for what was clearly going to become a law enforcement matter. Madison's social media audience was growing as word spread about her dramatic apartment confrontation. Her live stream viewers were offering commentary and advice, most of them urging her to stand her ground and don't let them intimidate you. The digital echo chamber was reinforcing her delusions while providing real-time documentation of federal crimes being committed. Sarah's backup was en route, but she had to manage an increasingly volatile situation with multiple unknown individuals in her secured residence. Madison was becoming more aggressive and demanding, insisting that Sarah prove her federal status by arresting someone or showing a warrant. The disconnect between Madison's television-based understanding of law enforcement and actual federal procedures was creating dangerous misunderstandings. The moving crew was trapped between conflicting authorities, both claiming legitimate control over the apartment. They'd been paid in advance by Madison and were reluctant to abandon expensive furniture they'd spent hours positioning. But Sarah's federal credentials and calm professional demeanor were clearly more credible than Madison's increasingly hysterical claims about family property rights. Through my security app, I could see the disaster reaching critical mass. Madison was holding ground she had no legal right to occupy, confronting a federal agent in her own home, while my parents were ascending in the elevator with celebration supplies for their daughter's imaginary housing triumph. The collision between my family's entitled dysfunction and federal law enforcement was about to create consequences that would reshape all of our lives in ways none of us could have anticipated. Sarah's calm professionalism was about to be tested by the arrival of parents who genuinely believed their daughter was the rightful apartment resident, and Madison's delusions were about to encounter the reality of federal criminal justice in its most unforgiving form. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor to reveal my parents, Janet and Robert Walsh, approaching what they believed was their daughter's triumphant, housewarming celebration. Instead, they walked directly into a federal law enforcement incident that was about to destroy their comfortable delusions about family dynamics and criminal consequences. Madison, sweetheart, my mother called out cheerfully as she spotted her daughter through the open apartment door. We brought champagne to celebrate your new place. Your father insisted on stopping for the good stuff because we're so proud of how you worked things out with Darian. Their entrance transformed an already surreal situation into something approaching complete chaos. Sarah now faced not just one delusional intruder, but an entire family convinced they had legitimate rights to her federally protected residence. Madison seized on their arrival as validation of her position, immediately recruiting them as allies in her confrontation with what she continued to insist was a fake federal agent. "Mom, Dad, perfect timing," Madison announced dramatically. "This woman is trying to steal Darian's apartment while he's out of the country on business. She's got some kind of fake federal badge and everything. It's obviously an elaborate scam targeting military families while they're deployed overseas." Sarah attempted to address my parents with the same professional courtesy she'd shown Madison, but their response revealed the depth of family dysfunction that had created this crisis. They didn't just believe Madison's version of events. They actively supported her increasingly aggressive stance against federal authority. "Young lady," my father said sternly, addressing Sarah with the tone he'd probably used during his military service decades earlier. "I don't know what kind of con game you're running, but you picked the wrong family to mess with. My son is serving our country overseas, and we won't tolerate anyone taking advantage of his sacrifice." The federal credentials that had impressed building security and intimidated the moving crew meant nothing to parents who'd spent years enabling Madison's reality-distorting manipulations. They'd become so accustomed to accepting her versions of events that contradictory evidence simply couldn't penetrate their willful blindness to her behavior patterns. Sarah made one more attempt at reasonable resolution. She produced her official federal identification, her building lease agreement, and documentation from Harbor Point Towers management, confirming her legitimate residency. She explained carefully that Darian Walsh had terminated his lease 2 weeks earlier, and that she was the current legal tenant with full rights to the apartment. Madison's response was to tear up the lease documents while screaming that they were obviously forged and that no legitimate federal agent would steal apartments from military families. She called the building manager local police and even attempted to contact the FBI field office, insisting that a federal imposter had invaded her brother's home with fake credentials and fraudulent paperwork. My parents supported every aspect of Madison's escalating hysteria. They began recording video on their phones, planning to create evidence for the lawsuits they intended to file against building management, Sarah herself, and anyone else involved in what they perceived as an elaborate conspiracy to defraud their family of rightful property. The situation reached peak absurdity when Madison produced what she claimed were text message conversations with me, authorizing her apartment occupation. The screenshots were obviously fabricated, showing conversations that had never occurred and agreements I'd never made. She'd apparently spent considerable time creating fake digital evidence to support her planned apartment takeover. Building management arrived within minutes of Sarah's radio call for supervisor assistance. The building manager, a professional woman named Patricia Morrison, had dealt with tenant disputes before, but never anything approaching this level of delusion and federal law enforcement involvement. She brought comprehensive documentation proving Sarah's legitimate tenancy and Darian Walsh's voluntary lease termination. Madison's response to official building records was to insist that Patricia Morrison was part of the conspiracy and threaten lawsuits against Harbor Point Towers for housing fraud and discrimination against military families. She demanded to speak with corporate ownership city housing authorities and federal oversight agencies about what she characterized as systematic apartment theft targeting deployed service members. The moving crew had finally escaped during the chaos, abandoning expensive furniture they'd been hired to position, but refusing to remain involved in what was clearly criminal activity. The locksmith had disappeared entirely, probably recognizing legal trouble when he saw it and wanting no further involvement in forced entry operations. Sarah's supervisor, Deputy Marshal James Rodriguez, arrived with backup officers and immediately assessed the federal implications of the situation. Madison's break-in had occurred at the residence of a federal agent involved in dangerous fugitive recovery operations, transforming simple trespassing into potential federal terrorism charges, depending on her motivations and background. The federal investigation began immediately. Sarah's residential security was compromised requiring immediate threat assessment and potential relocation depending on whether Madison's actions were isolated family dysfunction or part of larger targeting against federal law enforcement personnel. The stakes were suddenly much higher than simple apartment invasion. Madison attempted to claim diplomatic immunity when she realized federal agents were treating her as a serious criminal rather than a family member resolving housing disputes. She insisted that my international government work provided family protection under treaties she couldn't name and demanded immediate contact with embassy officials to resolve what she characterized as an international incident. My parents continued supporting her increasingly bizarre legal theories, threatening to contact their senator, the State Department, and military advocacy organizations about federal harassment of service families. They genuinely believed they were protecting their daughter from government overreach rather than watching her commit serious federal crimes with potential terrorism implications. The discovery that changed everything came when Deputy Rodriguez found Madison's research materials. Her purse contained printed building layouts, resident directories, and detailed notes about security procedures she'd gathered through months of surveillance and planning. This wasn't spontaneous family drama, but premeditated criminal activity with federal agent targeting. The revelation that Madison had been systematically researching federal law enforcement residential security transformed her family emergency apartment break-in into something approaching domestic terrorism investigation. Her months of preparation combined with targeting a federal agent's secure residence triggered mandatory national security protocols that would reshape the entire case. Sarah's calm professionalism throughout the crisis had documented everything necessary for federal prosecution. But the discovery of Madison's planning materials suggested this was just the beginning of a much larger investigation into potential threats against federal law enforcement personnel and their families. The scope of Madison's criminal activity expanded dramatically when Deputy Rodriguez's investigation team discovered her illegal database access through her friend working at the county clerk's office. What had initially appeared to be entitled family dysfunction was revealing itself as systematic targeting of federal law enforcement personnel using official government resources. Madison's friend Jennifer Powell worked as a data entry clerk for Porter County and had been providing Madison with confidential information about property records, vehicle registrations, and address changes for federal employees throughout Northwest Indiana and Chicago. The database queries showed Madison had been researching not just my living situation, but the residential patterns of multiple federal agents, judges, and prosecutors. The federal investigation uncovered that Madison's photography project, documenting urban decay, had actually been cover for surveillance activities targeting law enforcement families. Her carefully composed photographs of abandoned buildings were actually detailed documentation of federal safe houses, witness protection locations, and secure facilities used by various agencies. From my London apartment, I was watching my family's dysfunction transform into a national security investigation. The consulting firm Tech Secure International was monitoring the situation closely because my security clearance was essential for NATO cybersecurity projects that couldn't proceed without verified personnel. British immigration authorities had been notified that my American family members were under federal investigation for potential terrorism-related activities. My parents' reaction to the expanding criminal charges revealed the complete depth of their denial about Madison's behavior. When federal agents explained that their daughter faced potential 25-year sentences for targeting federal law enforcement, they insisted the charges were obviously politically motivated and threatened to contact international human rights organizations about persecution of American families. The financial investigation uncovered systematic fraud that had been ongoing for 3 years. Madison had used my personal information to open credit lines, apply for loans, and establish accounts that she'd been using to fund what investigators were now calling domestic surveillance operations. The total damages exceeded $200,000 across multiple financial institutions. More disturbing was the discovery that Madison had been selling information about federal employee residential patterns to online forums focused on government accountability and law enforcement criticism. She'd been monetizing her illegal database access by providing detailed personal information about federal agents to groups that advocacy organizations had identified as potential domestic terrorism threats. My parents hired an expensive criminal defense attorney who immediately recognized the hopelessness of Madison's legal situation. Attorney Michael Brennan explained that federal charges involving law enforcement targeting carried mandatory minimum sentences with limited plea bargain opportunities. The terrorism-related enhancements could result in life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The international complications became severe when British authorities learned that Madison's database searches had included information about federal agents working international cases involving British-American cooperation. Her illegal access had potentially compromised ongoing investigations, witness protection programs, and diplomatic security arrangements between allied nations. TechSecure International's legal department informed me that maintaining family contact during the federal investigation could jeopardize not only my security clearance, but the company's government contracts worth millions of dollars. I faced an impossible choice between supporting my family and protecting my career and legal status in Britain. Madison's desperation reached new levels when she realized the severity of federal sentencing guidelines. She attempted to negotiate plea agreements by claiming I had recruited her for insurance fraud schemes involving fake apartment residency claims. She provided fabricated evidence suggesting I'd planned to collect insurance money using her temporary residence documentation. Federal investigators easily disproved Madison's accusations against me, but her willingness to falsely implicate her own brother in federal crimes demonstrated the complete breakdown of family relationships and her inability to accept responsibility for her actions. The false accusations actually added perjury and federal obstruction charges to her growing list of criminal violations. My parents' financial situation deteriorated rapidly as legal fees consumed their retirement savings. Attorney Brennan explained that federal asset forfeiture laws could result in seizure of property used to support criminal activities, potentially including their mortgaged home if it was determined that family resources had funded Madison's illegal operations. The discovery that Madison had recruited other family friends for information-gathering activities expanded the federal investigation to include conspiracy charges against multiple individuals. Her database access had been part of a larger network involving county employees, disgruntled former law enforcement personnel, and anti-government activists sharing classified information. British immigration attorneys explained that family criminal convictions could affect my permanent residency application and future citizenship eligibility. The international security implications meant that maintaining any family contact during the investigation could be interpreted as supporting domestic terrorism activities regardless of my personal intentions or knowledge. Sarah's supervisor informed her that the residential security breach required immediate relocation to a safe house, while investigators determined the full scope of Madison's targeting activities. Her professional life was disrupted, her personal safety compromised, and her federal service record permanently marked by an incident she had no role in creating. The media attention intensified when national security journalists learned that domestic terrorism charges were being filed against individuals targeting federal law enforcement families. Madison's case became a prominent example of how social media radicalization and anti-government sentiment could evolve into actual criminal targeting of federal personnel. The most shocking revelation came when federal analysis of Madison's social media activities revealed connections to organized groups advocating violence against law enforcement officers and government officials. Her apartment break-in hadn't been isolated family dysfunction, but part of broader domestic terrorism networks that federal agencies had been investigating for months. Madison's illegal database access had provided these anti-government groups with detailed personal information about federal agents and their families, information that was being used to plan harassment campaigns, intimidation activities, and potentially violent attacks against law enforcement personnel across multiple states. The federal investigation was expanding beyond individual criminal charges to include national security implications that could affect international cooperation, diplomatic relationships, and ongoing counterterrorism operations. My family's dysfunction had inadvertently connected to domestic terrorism networks that federal agencies considered serious threats to national security. The FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force assumed control of Madison's case when database analysis revealed that her illegal searches included federal judges handling organized crime prosecutions, witnesses in protection programs, and undercover agents working domestic terrorism investigations. What my parents still insisted was a family misunderstanding had become a federal counterterrorism priority with international implications. Special Agent Diana Castellanos, the task force supervisor, explained to me, via secure international communication, that Madison's targeting pattern matched known domestic terrorism methodologies used by anti-government extremist groups. Her systematic collection of federal employee personal information, combined with her social media connections to radical organizations, had triggered the highest levels of federal security protocols. My parents faced their own federal investigation when agents discovered that Robert's military background and extensive gun collection had been used to establish credibility within anti-government online communities, where Madison shared stolen federal employee information. They weren't just enabling Madison's criminal behavior. They'd unknowingly become part of domestic terrorism networks, targeting law enforcement families. Federal agents seized my parents' computers, phones, and financial records as part of the expanding investigation. Their threatening phone calls to Sarah were being analyzed for domestic terrorism indicators, and their social media activities were reviewed for connections to anti-government groups and law enforcement targeting operations. Madison's attempt to represent herself in federal court created additional complications when she began filing pro-SE motions demanding sisters' rights and apartment inheritance laws, while facing federal terrorism charges. Her complete disconnect from legal reality was providing prosecutors with evidence of either incompetency or deliberate obstruction of federal proceedings. The international pressure on my situation intensified when NATO security officials learned that my family members were under federal terrorism investigation. The cybersecurity projects I was consulting on involved classified information sharing between allied nations, and my family's criminal activities created potential security vulnerabilities that required immediate resolution. British authorities conducted their own investigation into my background and security status, questioning my fitness for continued work on sensitive international projects. The American Criminal Family Association could affect not only my personal immigration status, but Britain's willingness to share classified information with American contractors who had compromised family situations. Madison's jail phone calls revealed the most disturbing aspect of her criminal mindset. She was actively recruiting other inmates to continue harassment against Sarah after release, planning what she called a justice campaign against federal agents who destroy families. These recorded threats added federal witness intimidation charges that carried potential life sentences. The financial investigation uncovered that Madison had been receiving payments from anti-government organizations for her stolen federal employee information. Her art photography business was actually a front for domestic terrorism financing, with payments disguised as legitimate commercial transactions for creative services. Federal psychologists evaluated Madison for trial competency and found evidence of narcissistic personality disorder combined with anti-government radicalization that made her genuinely believe her criminal activities were justified resistance against federal tyranny. She showed no remorse for endangering federal agents and their families. Sarah's professional life was permanently altered by Madison's targeting activities. She was transferred to enhanced security housing with complete address protection and assigned to federal training duties rather than field operations until investigators could determine whether other federal agents remained at risk from Madison's network activities. The congressional investigation began when House oversight committees learned that county database access was being systematically exploited by domestic terrorism networks to target federal law enforcement personnel. Madison's case became the focal point for hearings about information security and protection of federal employee personal data. Media coverage transformed Madison from local criminal defendant to national symbol of domestic terrorism threats against law enforcement families. Her deleted social media posts were recovered and analyzed by federal experts who found clear evidence of radicalization, progression from family dysfunction to anti-government extremism. Prison officials placed Madison in federal isolation for her own protection after other inmates learned she was targeting law enforcement families. Federal prisoners include many individuals arrested by the same agencies Madison had been working to compromise, creating dangerous personal safety situations within the prison system. My parents lost their mortgaged home to legal fees and federal asset forfeiture procedures. They were forced to relocate to a different state to escape media attention and community ostracism, while facing their own potential federal charges for supporting domestic terrorism activities through Madison's criminal operations. The federal sentencing guidelines for Madison's combined charges included terrorism enhancements that could result in life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Her recorded jail conversations planning continued law enforcement targeting, meant that federal prosecutors would seek the maximum possible sentences to protect public safety. International security officials informed me that maintaining any family contact during the ongoing investigation could be interpreted as supporting domestic terrorism activities regardless of my personal intentions. The choice between family loyalty and professional survival had become a choice between family and potential criminal charges. Federal investigators discovered that Madison's targeting activities had compromised ongoing investigations, endangered witnesses in protection programs, and potentially contributed to security breaches that affected national security operations. The full scope of damage from her criminal network was still being assessed by federal agencies. The realization that my family's dysfunction had evolved into actual domestic terrorism targeting federal law enforcement created a permanent separation that couldn't be bridged by traditional family reconciliation. Madison's radicalization had destroyed not just her own life, but the entire family structure that had enabled her destructive progression. Federal District Judge Patricia Hawkins sentenced Madison to 28 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for the first 20 years. The sentence included convictions for domestic terrorism, federal agent intimidation, identity theft, witness, tampering, and conspiracy to target law enforcement families. Judge Hawkins specifically noted Madison's complete lack of remorse and her continued threats against federal personnel even while facing trial. The defendant has shown a pattern of escalating criminal behavior that poses ongoing threats to federal law enforcement officers and their families, Judge Hawkins stated during sentencing. Her systematic targeting of federal agents' personal information, combined with her connections to domestic terrorism networks, requires the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines to protect public safety. Madison's final statement to the court demonstrated the complete failure of her narcissistic worldview to accept responsibility for her actions. She insisted that federal agents had destroyed her family and that her imprisonment represented government persecution of citizens seeking accountability from law enforcement agencies. Her lack of remorse guaranteed that parole consideration would be denied repeatedly throughout her incarceration. My parents faced federal charges as co-conspirators in Madison's domestic terrorism activities. Robert received 18 months in federal prison for providing weapons-related expertise to anti-government networks, while Janet received 12 months for money laundering related to payments Madison received for stolen federal employee information. They lost their mortgaged home retirement savings and were permanently barred from federal employment or contractor positions. The federal government relocated Sarah to enhanced security housing with complete address confidentiality and assigned her to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. Her experience with Madison's targeting became the foundation for new federal protocols protecting law enforcement families from domestic terrorism threats. She developed training programs that are now mandatory for all federal agents nationwide. My permanent residency application in Britain was approved after extensive background investigations, confirmed my complete separation from family criminal activities. TechSecure International promoted me to senior partner in recognition of my professional integrity under extreme family pressure. The cybersecurity consulting firm now specializes in protecting government contractors from family-based security vulnerabilities. British and American security agencies used Madison's case to develop new protocols for international information sharing when contractor families pose potential security risks. My situation became a model for maintaining security clearances while managing compromised family situations that could affect Allied intelligence cooperation. The financial recovery process took 2 years, but insurance claims and federal victim compensation programs eventually restored most of the money Madison had stolen through identity theft. I established the Family Boundary Education Foundation, using settlement funds to provide scholarships and counseling for young people escaping toxic family manipulation and financial abuse. Madison's case established new federal sentencing guidelines for family member crimes against federal law enforcement personnel. Courts now consider domestic terrorism enhancements when family relationships are used to target federal agents, regardless of the perpetrator's claimed motivations or emotional justifications for criminal behavior. 3 years into Madison's sentence, federal prison counselors reported the first signs of genuine remorse and acceptance of responsibility for her actions. She began participating in victim impact awareness programs and started acknowledging that her targeting of federal agents had endangered innocent people and their families. True rehabilitation required abandoning her lifelong pattern of blaming others for consequences of her choices. My parents completed their federal sentences and entered intensive family therapy to address the enabling behaviors that had contributed to Madison's criminal development. They now speak publicly at conferences about toxic family dynamics, warning other parents about the dangers of supporting entitled behavior that can escalate into serious criminal activity. Robert and Janet moved to a modest apartment in Arizona, rebuilding their lives around healthy relationship patterns and individual accountability rather than family manipulation and emotional blackmail. They learned to support their children through encouragement and boundaries, rather than enabling destructive behaviors that ultimately hurt everyone involved. The community education programs developed from Madison's case now operate in 12 states, helping families recognize manipulation patterns, establish healthy boundaries, and understand legal consequences of enabling criminal behavior. Madison's hometown uses her case as a cautionary example in high school programs about family responsibility and individual accountability. My consulting practice expanded internationally after developing expertise in family-based security threats that compromise government, contractors, and federal employees. The personal experience with family manipulation became valuable professional knowledge for protecting national security from domestic vulnerabilities that traditional background investigations often miss. Sarah's career flourished at the Federal Training Center, where her residential security experience became essential knowledge for protecting federal law enforcement families from emerging domestic terrorism threats. She married a fellow federal agent and adopted 2 children, building the secure family life that Madison's targeting had temporarily disrupted. 5 years after Madison's sentencing, I visited my parents in Arizona for the first time since the federal investigation began. They had genuinely transformed their approach to family relationships, supporting individual growth rather than demanding emotional or financial sacrifice. We built new relationships based on mutual respect rather than guilt and manipulation. The most important lesson from this experience was understanding that family love sometimes requires allowing people to face natural consequences of their destructive choices rather than protecting them from accountability. Enabling harmful behavior isn't compassion. It's often the cruelest form of family dysfunction because it prevents growth and healing. Madison's federal imprisonment forced everyone in our family to confront fundamental questions about responsibility boundaries and genuine support versus destructive enabling. The apartment break-in was just the visible culmination of years of family patterns that needed dramatic intervention to create positive change. Federal law enforcement families now receive enhanced security protections developed from Sarah's experience with domestic terrorism targeting. Madison's case contributed to congressional legislation improving database security and preventing county employees from providing personal information to domestic terrorism networks. 7 years later, Madison will become eligible for parole consideration, but federal guidelines require demonstrated rehabilitation and victim impact acknowledgement that may take many more years to achieve. Her case continues serving as a federal training example for domestic terrorism prosecution and family-based security threat assessment. The apartment that started this entire crisis now houses a federal judge who specifically chose the location because of its enhanced security measures developed after Madison's targeting activities. Harbor Point Towers became a model for residential security protecting federal law enforcement personnel from domestic terrorism threats. The most profound realization was that setting boundaries isn't abandonment. It's often the most loving action possible when family members engage in destructive behavior. True family support requires honesty, accountability, and sometimes the courage to let people experience consequences that motivate genuine change and personal growth. Our story demonstrates that family loyalty doesn't require accepting criminal behavior or sacrificing individual well-being to enable destructive patterns. Sometimes the most loving thing family members can do is refuse to participate in manipulation while remaining open to healthy relationships based on mutual respect and individual responsibility. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members whose behavior was affecting your life negatively? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how you handled challenging family situations while maintaining your own integrity and well-being. If this story resonated with your experiences, please give it a like to help others who might be dealing with similar family dynamics. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming difficult situations and building healthier relationships. Your subscription helps me continue sharing experiences that might help others navigate complex family challenges with wisdom and courage. Please share this story with anyone who might benefit from understanding how healthy boundaries and personal accountability can transform even the most dysfunctional family situations into opportunities for genuine growth and positive change. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you wisdom and strength in building the healthy, respectful relationships you deserve in your own life